Comrades, on the 15th, I was having dinner with Simon and Jenny at the Jashan Indian restaurant in Haringey. And Simon, for some reason, started looking at his phone and said, "The military seems to have closed down the bridge over the Bosphorus." And I thought, well, maybe there's repairs going on. And then 3 minutes later, Jenny and I are having this wonderful conversation. Simon's looking at his phone again, and he says, "Oh, that's funny. They seem to have closed down the airport." At which point I knew it's not repairs. There's a military coup going on. Now in Turkey, this is not an unusual occurrence. There have been coups in 1960, 1971, 1980, 1997, and these are successful coups which overthrew governments, and then, 2 or 3 unsuccessful ones, all in my lifetime. So I know a coup when I read about it. So I went straight back home. I happened to be in London for Marxism, because I was doing a talk there. And having come from Marxism, I thought I'd stay a bit longer. So I go home, immediately in front of the computer, start following what's happening in Turkey. And indeed, it is a coup, tanks in the streets, and these days, this is the first coup that I've been able to do this. I'm following comrades in Turkey, communicating over WhatsApp and various other internet things. So I know what's going on, almost as if I was there. And there's military aircraft flying over Istanbul and Ankara. Comrades are writing about aircraft flying past and then bombs exploding. I actually think those were sonic booms, they were not bombs. But, troops in the streets, tanks in the streets, all of that. My first feeling was, yes, I'm in London! My second feeling was guilt, because I thought, oh God, I'm now going to start getting news about comrades being jailed, about people hanged, all that, all of this has happened in the past. Luckily, of course, it isn't luck, it's something altogether different. It didn't succeed. And I'll come to why I think it didn't succeed towards the end of the meeting. But before I do this, I suppose I need to explain some background. And this is extremely difficult to do if we had 2 days in this room. In 17 minutes that I've got left, it's even more difficult to do. But there are 3 main things I'd like to explain very briefly, so you get an idea of why this keeps happening in Turkey. And the 3 things I want to explain are Kemalism, the Islamic movement, and the Gülen religious order. You may be aware that the coup is now being blamed by the government on the Gülen people. To most people in the West, what the hell is Gülen? There's no such thing here. So, let me explain those 3 things and then talk about the coup itself. First of all, Kemalism. Kemalism, after Kemal Atatürk, the founder of Turkey, so-called, is the founding ideology of the Turkish Republic, 1923, and has been the official ideology of the state ever since. It is strong Turkish nationalism. It is the belief that the state knows best, and the effect of this on ordinary people has been, for something like 90 years, that the Kemalist founding fathers, and then after them the people who ran the Turkish state, believed, had an image of a modern nation state, the Turkish, the nation state for Turks, which had to be, I suppose the best way to explain it to you is, had to be like France. So, you know, people would have to dress in the way we're dressed here, not in the way people used to dress at the end of the Ottoman Empire. So dress was changed, opera and symphonies were encouraged and Turkish music discouraged. The language was purified to make it, take it back to its original Turkish roots. A whole series of modernizing so-called reforms, and the idea of modern was to set up a country like France. And one other thing, people needed to be not very religious. And a model Turkish citizen, in the minds of a Kemalist leader, is one who may be religious at home, but not publicly. So, secularism, in other words, which they got from the Western European model. So, there's that. Second thing, Islam. We're talking of a country which, even today, something like 70% of women cover their heads, and this is, you know, fact, statistical fact, and more impressionistically, a huge majority, at least 70%, in describing themselves would say Islam is a major part, religion is a major part of who they are, of how they want to live. Doesn't mean radical Islam, doesn't mean fundamentalism, it just means people are generally religious. However, because the Kemalist model of a model citizen, of an ideal Turkish citizen, required them not to be religious, the Turkish state has, for 90 years, effectively excluded religious people from the political scene, from the levers of power. In particular periods in Turkish history, it was even the case that women wearing a headscarf were not allowed into universities, they could not get jobs in the public sector. You get the idea. But this wasn't just ideological, also has a class element, because over time, a middle class, upper middle class emerged who looked like me, dressed like me, had the sort of education which I had, which meant an American school in Istanbul, possibly education abroad after school, completely westernized, and this class had an absolute disdain when they looked at the mass of the population who were religious. And the disdain was very much a class thing. So, for example, a middle-class Turk has no problem with a headscarf if the headscarf is worn by the cleaning lady who comes and cleans your house. But it's a problem if a woman wearing a headscarf comes and does her shopping in the same expensive shops that you shop at. So the states and the middle and upper middle classes denigration of ordinary people took two forms. First, a class element, but also an element of these are believers, they are backward, they are uneducated, they live in medieval darkness. You recognize some of those themes, don't you, from Western Islamophobia, whereby religion is equated with somehow something medieval and dark. This is a very common official approach in Turkey. Okay. As a result, there has always been tension in Turkey between the state mechanism and the main establishment parties and the mass of the population. And it is this tension which causes the state, mainly the military, but not just the military, the judiciary, university vice-chancellors, the media, and ordinary people. So that whenever the state feels that it's losing control, you get a military takeover. That's why Turkish history has so many military takeovers, because it's a state which constantly imposes a lifestyle on people who people are not comfortable with. This explains why there was a coup this time. Because in 1996, a political party came to power for the first time in Turkey, which spoke the language of Islam. It didn't do very much, which was Islamic, but it spoke the discourse of Islam. Within less than a year, the military issued a memorandum, and the government packed its bags and left, rather than face what it knew he was going to face, a forceful military takeover using force. And the state relaxed because they were used to doing this. But what they were not used to was that a party split away from this party which had been overthrown, and within 5 years came to power. That's the current government, came to power in 2002. So this government comes clearly from an Islamic tradition. All of its members are believers. But if you look at what it's done, and it's 14 years now that they've been in power, there is nothing which you can put your finger on and say, this is Islamization of the country, or this is fundamentalist Islam taking the country over. What they have done, however, is to make ordinary people, believers, feel comfortable. For the first time, the mass of the population, this party regularly gets 40 to 50% of the vote in general and local elections. And ordinary people look to this party and they see people they can empathise and sympathise with, people who look like themselves, people who speak like themselves. And this is for the first time in Turkish history. This explains why this government is so popular. Although the government suffers from the basic contradiction which all Islamic governments in the Middle East have always faced and always will face. The contradiction is the party comes to power and continues to do the business of running Turkish capitalism. But it comes to power with the votes of poor working people who want change. Poor working people who, like anywhere else in the world, want a better life. It isn't that they vote for these parties, be it the AKP in Turkey or the Muslim Brothers in Egypt or various other examples. It isn't that they vote for these parties because they want the country to be completely Islamized. They vote for these people because they think, all right, these people will, bring some reforms in, make our lives better. There is a tendency to think of believers as just believers. Well, yes, they're believers, but they're also normal people. Just like anyone else, they have aspirations in this world. They want a better life. So they vote these Islamic parties into power and then are disappointed. The clear-cut example, of course, is Morsi, the Muslim brother president for a year in Egypt. The very same contradiction works in Turkey. But, good Lord, nevertheless, very large numbers of people, 40 to 50%, continue to vote for the AKP because they know that the alternative is to revert to a Kemalist state which does not allow them to live as they want to live. Okay, so that's, I've set the scene, and I seem to be running out of time. Now, the AKP, ever since it came to power in 2002, has faced the possibility, much more strongly in the early period, of being overthrown by the military. Not because of anything particular that it does or has done, but because the military considers itself as an institution as the defender of secular modern Turkey, which rules out Islamists, believers, etc. in government. So this government has always faced this problem, which is why in its early period it actually made sure that a very large number of generals, plotters, were imprisoned. But nevertheless, because it's basically a conservative, right-wing, neoliberal government, it would love to work together with the state. Conservatives have no problem with the state. What it didn't quite realize was that the state is not prepared to work with people it considers to be Islamist. That is the only reason for the coup. This government has done everything the ruling class in Turkey would want it to do. Economically, there is nothing left in Turkey which hasn't been privatized. I mean, you know, think of a sort of Muslim Cameroon. That's what this government is. It has this Muslim colouring, but it's a conservative government. Therefore, there's no reason for the ruling class to want to see it toppled. The only reason is ideological, because it is perceived by the state and the army to be Islamic. Okay, so the coup happens. I was not in the least surprised. I keep boasting in public that 2 weeks before the coup, I was interviewed by a daily newspaper. And the guy asked me, what do you think will happen? And I said, this might happen, that might happen. This is before the coup. That might happen. And one of the things I said was a military coup. And the guy said, what? Why? Because Kemalism, Kemalist state, will never stomach a government from an Islamic tradition. I keep boasting about this, and I shall continue to do so. That's the reason the coup happened. What the plotters didn't envisage was the wonderful, magnificent response of ordinary people the moment they heard that something was happening. People in their thousands, completely spontaneously, mostly government supporters, but not exclusively government supporters, rushed out into the streets to three main places in Istanbul. To the bridge, which had been closed off. This is the bridge between Asia and Europe, which had been closed off by the military, to the airport, which had been closed off by the military, and to Taksim Square. You'll remember the square from the Gezi events 3 years ago. It's Trafalgar Square, it's the central square of Istanbul. It was magnificent. You'll have seen some of it, I'm sure, on television and on the social media. People climbing onto tanks and trying to open the turret, or whatever it's called. And there's armed soldiers inside. I mean, what the hell happens if you open it? But people were doing it. Incredible. I mean, I was shocked. And this has never happened in Turkish history, and the military did not expect it. I think You know, there's been a lot in the media about what kind of coup is this? It's inept. It wasn't inept. I think what happened was that the rest of the army was going to join in. They didn't when they saw thousands in the streets. Because it's one thing arresting the president and the prime minister and the cabinet and radio and television and the airport. It's another to have to shoot hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people in the street. The Turkish army has never had this problem. So the moment that happened, the rest of the army decided not to join in. Basically, they sold out the people who'd been, you know, the first into the breach. And that's how the coup was averted. There are other accidental elements. They happened to fail to get the president. But I don't think that matters. What mattered was the crowds in the street. Okay, what's happening now? The third thing I was going to explain. The Gülen movement is a religious order. The guy is a cleric, an Islamic cleric. He lives in Pennsylvania. He's in exile because, of course, the Turkish state for decades had been hounding him for being an Islamist. So he lives in the States. No doubt he's being used by the Americans. And in the first half of the AKP government, the Gülen order and the government were in alliance. They worked together very well. And then at one point the alliance fell apart. Probably because Gülen wanted more ministries, more security chiefs, his members to be brought to higher positions. At some point they fell apart. I don't care how. Since then, the government has been saying, these people are trying to overthrow us, the legitimate government of the country. Which is a bit rich, given that they've been in such a close alliance in the earlier period. But nevertheless, what the government is doing now is saying this coup was all planned and executed by the Gülen people. Now, it seems clear that they were involved, but it's bollocks to say they did it. There are something like 300 plus generals in the Turkish army. At the moment, 120 something are in prison, or more. I think it went up yesterday or today. There is no way a religious order will have penetrated the armed forces to that extent. More than a third of top generals. No way. But what the government is doing by blaming just the Gülen people is basically, what's the expression? Failing to blame the state. So basically, there's a word I'm after, it won't come. Anyway,
Letting him off the hook, we say.
Yes, they're letting the state and the rest of the armed forces off the hook. And that's what they're doing. This is dangerous. This means within 10 years, there'll be another coup. The second thing they're doing, and this is also worrying, is they immediately declared a state of emergency. A state of emergency means no law. It means they can do anything the hell they want. They can arrest who they want. They can do whatever. And there's nothing, as far as the judicial process goes, that you can do about it. This is to be expected. This is a conservative government which had been, anyway, getting increasingly authoritarian over the past 3, 4, 5 years. So in a way, this is now a golden opportunity for them to get even more authoritarian in a situation where they seem to be right to be doing so. So this seems to me our main job. When I say our, I don't mean Haringey branch, I mean the organisation in Turkey. This seems to be our main job. We were absolutely clear against the coup. We came out and had a press release the very same night against the coup. We were the only organisation on the left to do so, because the rest of the left was sort of thinking, to some degree or other, okay, we're not very happy about the coup, but at least we get rid of Erdogan. We don't take that line. An elected government, no matter how horrible, can never be as horrible as the military running the country. So we were very clear about that, but we need to be equally clear, and we are, that we also fight against all the breaches of democracy and human rights that the government may use in the forthcoming period. This is the special issue of our newspaper. We have a weekly, and what a coincidence, it's called Socialist Worker. And what it says is no to the coup, and here it says a solution, meaning the Kurdish issue, peace, a solution on democratization, not state of emergency. So I think in 6 words, the whole issue is summed up. Thank you. I have 10 questions for this piece. I'll just take them randomly. I mean, Alan and Fran, I think, brought up the question of Syrian refugees in Turkey, and more generally. There are 2.7 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. So when Britain says, oh, we'll take 1,200 more, or whatever number, it really is risible. It really is pathetic. And that is the case for the whole of the European Union. Now, the deal between the European Union and Turkey, most of you, I suppose, it was well covered in the media here, but it really is the most awful, inhuman thing. The deal is that Turkey will make sure that no Syrian refugees can pass through to Greece, because what will probably not have been in the Western press so much is that the western coast, the Aegean coast of Turkey, this wonderful tourist area, for the past 2 years is chock-a-block with Syrians trying to get across the Aegean Sea. And that's where they drown. That's where we get all the stories of people dying at sea. And there are shops in Istanbul which sell rubber dinghies, the owners of which have become extremely rich over the past 2-3 years, because they sell rubber dinghies which are going to sink at exorbitant prices to Syrian refugees. So Turkey has agreed to stop Syrian refugees in Western Turkey from making the journey, or attempting to make the journey, into Greece, because once in Greece, of course, they're in the European Union. And it just shows you it tells you something both about the European Union and the Turkish government. Turkey agreed to do this for €3 billion. So they were, in fact, selling people. I mean, there's no other way of putting it. In Turkey itself, you have to bear in mind, it's interesting, there is no serious racism against Syrians. Now, thank God at least for that, because, one effect might have been this huge rise in racism. There isn't, because they're Muslims as well. So, most Turks can see, all right, these people really are unfortunate people, and also think of them as our brother Muslims. there is some racism, of course, but it's not so bad. And again, within Turkey, the government has not been behaving as badly to the refugees as some European governments have been doing. The latest thing Erdogan said was that they would all be given Turkish citizenship. Whether they'll do that or not, I don't know. But, you know, the deal with the EU is one of the examples of what I mentioned in my talk, the contradictions between the base and the top of the AKP government party. Because people at the bottom, you know, obviously want Syrian refugees to be helped, but of course what the government can do is limited, given that they're in the business of running Turkish capitalism. And the sellout was so obvious that it was one thing we could really use politically to drive a wedge between the leadership and the base of the AKP. The question at the back about what policies of the government was it that the military didn't like. Not at all. That was the point I was trying to make. The sole reason for the military not to like the government is that it comes from an Islamic tradition, obviously uses more of an Islamic language than Turkish governments in the past, or me. But the government has nothing. I mean, it even took them 10 years to allow women wearing the headscarf to go to university. That's how carefully they were treading. Because that was one of the main demands of their base. And us, I mean, we fought very hard for women wearing their headscarf to be able to go to university. So it's purely ideological. It just goes against Kemalism's grain, even to think that the wife of the president wears a headscarf. It just makes their hair stand on it. You know, just like a Western European Islamophobe would see a woman wearing a headscarf or a hijab or whatever. But that's how Turkish Kemalists see it. Now, I think it was Paul at the end who brought it up. That is one reason why much of the Turkish left, and I didn't say very much about this in my talk, was very much in two minds as the coup was going on. And some parts of the Turkish left were not even in two minds. They were very clear they wanted the coup to succeed, because, you know, they're equally Islamophobic. Once it was obvious that the coup was not going to succeed, there was no one who said, oh, what a pity. But then what the Kemalists, many of whom consider themselves to be left-wing, and the left, once the coup did not succeed, what they started saying was, oh, these people are all AKP supporters. No one from the left joined the crowds fighting the tanks. And the argument was, these people are shouting, God is great. Allah is great. Yes, and so, I mean, you don't have to shout it. But the idea that someone is shouting that bothers much of the Turkish left, stops them from joining that crowd. I actually sent a tweet which said, we need to be in the streets. And I then had to delete, to block 200 plus people who were just swearing at me. Sorry, me and my mother, and you swear rather more colourfully in the Middle East. I had to block these people just because I had said we need to be with these people facing the tanks. So, does it? Maybe that gives you a flavour of it. Yes, I know, but there are 10 of them. Okay. John's question. question right at the beginning. You know, there's a war that the Turkish state and government are fighting in Turkish Kurdistan. So who the hell is going to fight it now with more than a third of the generals in prison? This is very nice, because there's been no news, no bad news of people being killed from the Kurdish region for the past 10 days. More or less, none, almost none at all. And that's obviously must be because the army doesn't know what the hell it's doing. But that's why I thought there would not now be a coup. Because, you know, it's like changing horses in mid-stream. You know, you don't change, you know, overthrow the government in the middle of a war. That's why I thought there wouldn't be one. They did it possibly because the military thought, if we're in power, then we run the war just as we want, and we can be more effective, and we don't even have to worry about the tiny bit of worry that the government might have about human rights and, you know, some sort of democratic behavior. Not that the government had much worry about that, but they would have had a bit more than what the military would have done. So I don't know the answer. And the armed forces would put themselves together. That's why the government is making sure that the whole of the armed forces is not blamed, but Gulen is blamed. Inge, I will tell you what the PKK thinks in the pub.
I can't go, I've got an early night tonight.
Okay.
Tell us.
The approach of the Kurdish movement, basically the PKK, initially was not very good. Their first pronouncement, press release or whatever pronouncement, was not very good at all. They were sort of shilly-shallying. They were saying, we're against the coup, of course, but we're also against civilian dictatorship. Now, that sounds fine. I'm also against both of those things. But while there's a coup going on, if you're saying no to this and no to that, while one of them is actually going on with tanks in the streets, then what you're really saying is, I don't mind if the coup succeeds. They then correct, and this, I think, in the heart of hearts of every PKK member, the enmity towards Erdogan is so strong that they would like to see the back of him, hopefully, preferably hanging, whoever does it. And this we need to argue against. They then corrected their position within 2 or 3 days. More recently, Demirtas, who's the civilian leader of the civilian branch of the movement, wing of the movement, made a pronouncement which is very good. So we need to be against coups in every position. Fine. But their initial pronouncement was, gave the game away. There were other questions, but they would, like Pete, your question would really, it's more of a discussion, you know, why did Gülen and the AKP fall apart? Fall apart? No, fall out. Fall out. You know, it's more of a discussion because we don't know. So there's a few points like that, Simon. Oh, yes, I will. This is the final one. And Simon said a few words about Turkey, Syria, etc. I think the original Turkish approach was when the Syrian revolution began to unravel and turn into an armed mess. The Turkish government thought, like every government in the world, was trying to get some leeway in there, we need forces on the ground. not Turkish troops, but some local forces we can influence. Early on, I think the Turkish government supported ISIS because the majority of Turks are Sunni Muslims. ISIS is a Sunni Muslim organization, so they thought, okay, here's it will give us a force on the ground. I think quite quickly they realized you can't control ISIS, and they stopped supporting it. Their main problem was, Simon mentioned it, to stop the creation of a Kurdish PKK-run state in northern Syria. That remains the foreign policy priority of the Turkish state. But they have a problem. In normal circumstances, they'd have sent the army into northern Syria and just deal with the Kurdish entity, Rojava. The problem is that the Americans are supporting the Kurds because the Kurds are the only effective force fighting against ISIS on the ground. And the Turkish army isn't going to do something which sabotages American interests. They're not going to be allowed to do it. But that is clearly a major bone of contention and negotiation between the Americans and the Turks. Of course, Turkey gets all its military hardware mainly from the Americans, although the Turkish economy is not a seriously big economy. It does have its own production, manufacturing, etc. Okay, I'll stop.